So I don't see anyone else joining us for the moment. So I suggest we get started. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining our first big conversation of this academic year. It's something that we started doing throughout the pandemic and thought it was of relevance to continue these valuable conversations on themes that we may not have the time to address in our very busy daily schedules. So most welcome to today's big conversation on rediscovering education through the lens of decolonisation. My name is Eefke de Lauw. I work at the Hague University of Applied Sciences at our Center of Expertise, Global and Inclusive Learning. And the big conversations are activities that are organized by our Global Educators Lab. This is a lab that is there to support colleagues, both internally and externally, in their professional development on big themes such as decolonisation, internationalisation, diversity and inclusion, and helping them to equip them with understanding and tools how to implement this in their teaching practice. So today's topic on decolonisation merits a little bit of background. Diversity and inclusion are high on the strategic agenda of many higher education institutions. But how do we move beyond a situation of tokenism, that we check boxes, and really critically look at patterns in our education? And more importantly, ask ourselves questions as to which voices, which perspectives are included and why, and which ones are we missing? Who are the silent voices and why are they excluded from our syllabi? Decolonisation is one of the ways to critically examine what we're including and excluding in our curriculum. And today we'll look at what can it involve, how does this work, and what can we learn from the process. And I'm delighted to have with us today two wonderful speakers. First of all, a very special welcome to Karine Hindrix. She is a researcher on education and development, a teacher educator, and also policy advisor for internationalization at UCL, so University College in Leuven in Belgium. And later on, she will probably talk about her professional and personal journey on decolonising education or Flemish higher education, commenting on an exploratory research project. So I'm very happy to have you with us today, Karine. And she's joined by one of The Hague colleagues, Tamara Lewis. She's worked at The Hague since 2015 as a learning experience designer and a senior lecturer for the International Law Program, and a researcher into international human rights. She's a member of our Global Citizenship Research Group, and currently she's conducting research with students looking into how human rights law is taught and whether the textbooks and curricula include decolonial perspectives. And she will take on the role of discussant, so she will give a response to Karine's address and hopefully lead us into a vibrant discussion. So before handing over to Karine, hopefully you remember to unmute yourself during the plenary part. If there's any questions or comments, then feel free to put them in the chat. I know sometimes as guests, for some reason, you might not have access to the chat. If that's the case, then just raise your hand and we'll call upon you as soon as possible. You have been notified that the session is also recorded. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Karine. Karine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eefke. Hello, everybody. First of all, I'm honored to be here and to be able to share with you some of my experience throughout a journey, part of which was also a applied research project on decolonising or traces of decolonisation in Flemish higher education. It's a context that was really for Flanders. In Belgium. So today I'm not presenting the results of that research. It's more about some issues that I have learned, and especially as a teacher educator, passionate on different levels of education, the shift I went through, especially through many authors that I was able to listen to or to read, some concepts that were mind-blowing as an educator and very interesting. So I'm going to share today a few of these ideas and concepts that I think were very an added value for the way I relate to education, and now in a completely different way. I was able to do research for 2 years from 2020 to 2022 with my colleague, Dr. Norma Juarez from UCLL or UC Leuven, that's one of the campuses in this area. And she grew up and stayed in Mexico until I think about 30 years old. So we did research from different positionalities. I come from Western Europe, a colonizing country, and she grew up in Latin America, a country that has known settler colonization in the past. So the reflections were also within that small group, within the two of us, very enriching. The research, when the research started, it was also COVID during the pandemic. And interestingly, suddenly seminars all over the world opened up, especially also in this area, of course, because I was looking for that. And that was very interesting. We had, even though I was involved with internationalization for many years, rarely I had such access to such interesting resources and knowledge during the pandemic. So what I share here today is the result of many interesting speakers, thinkers, authors that I was able to get to know and especially to learn from in a humble way. That's also what I want to say. So let's start a few of the ideas. At a certain point, I was not, that comes not from the research on decolonization, but I was following a workshop from colleagues on art-based research. And this is apparently a landmark in art-based research. It's a PhD that is written in a comic form by Nick Sousanis, and about starting from the idea how word has always been prior to images in constructing knowledge and in importance. And his research was on the interest on how do people create knowledge and the role of images in that. And I thought this page from his book, Unflattening, was a very interesting metaphor also for what I have been going to, where I start from, a more linear, boxed thinking or deep structure of my thinking towards, maybe what we can call chaos and different routes, a different way of looking at things. So I wanted to share that also to give an example or as a symbol, as an image. You can go on. One of the concepts that I thought was extremely interesting and I had never thought of, I was new when you jump into the discourse and the knowledge around decolonization, is the concept of unlearning. Probably most of you have heard it by now a bit more. I thought it was very interesting that the idea of unlearning, I don't know the good Dutch translation. I think the English is very well. Unlearning things that are so evident that you never questions and that seem not to be the case for everybody in society. Unlearning things, the way you see things, and then especially in the Western thinking, in my case, for example, how we categorize everything, how we hierarchize everything, how that is not always the case and not a standard thing to do, to question that, for example. But also unlearning the way we relate and what is, for example, considered as something that I would have never questioned. I remember that I was following a seminar of Walter Mignolo, one of the reference authors in decolonisation of higher education, and he was starting to criticize with his matrix of power, the university as a knowledge system. And then I remember that I was almost talking to my laptop like, we are not going to question that, are we? But yes, we were. And so all the things were dissected that you never questioned, that you thought were universal, to unlearn that they're not universal and that there is a pluriversality, as he says, or other authors say it is not the things that you thought you were universal for everybody, to unlearn that and to unlearn many things that seem so automatic and so logic, and with that comes pain. So if I tell you that I'm talking to my laptop during a seminar, then is it not because I enjoy it, but because I thought I cannot go to that place. I don't want to question that. And that is uncomfortable, that is hurtful, and sometimes unlearning that our good intentions are good intentions, but that they might be structured by deep biases, class, race, sex, or class structures, to unlearn that, to relearn that it can be different. That was one of the interesting things that I have gone through. I'm not sure if I'm clear in this. Yeah. Then we can go to another one. That is cognitive justice. Boaventura de Sousa Santos says there will be no social justice without cognitive justice. I never thought about that. And with that comes the concept of epistemic diversity. Of course, we talk a lot about diversity among features of people and students, but diversity within the content of the curriculum, the way theory is perceived, who constructs, who decides what knowledge will be treated, what knowledge is more evidently coming to the table in our higher education classes and research. So alternative knowledge systems, it's a very difficult place also to go, because of course it's the question like, is it evidence-based or not? And to start discussing that, you come in very difficult areas, and it makes you hardly difficult to discuss something, so we don't discuss it, or we go out of the way. And Boaventura de Sousa Santos has also written a very interesting article on the abyssal lines of knowledge, the abyss where we cannot go, but there are things to discuss and to think about. So epistemic diversity, epistemic justice, epistemicide. This also pops up, where knowledge systems are erased or not admissible. So that was also in the decolonisation journey of higher education, a very interesting concept to think about who decides what knowledge will be put in the course. Who am I? That structures always the thinking about that knowledge, and what knowledge we bring in, but also, and that leads me to the next point, what does that knowledge, the theory, mean to students or other people that are from their situatedness or their positionality? Of course, theories, you might be, it seems so logic now, but I didn't understand it fully until I was digging into or learning from that literature, that a theory is, from a positionality and life experiences, has different meanings, but also different experiences, how theory can help or be healing for different experiences. Or so the connectedness to what are we learning and what does that mean in different lives and situatedness and positionality. And it goes beyond taking into account the life world of the students. I will give you an example that is close to them. It goes beyond that. It does everything that they think about subjects. We should start from there. That's also what Bell Hooks says. I will talk about her later a little bit. Starting from there, but of course also going beyond their life experiences. That seems logic, but to me it was very opening up different ways of working in my practice. So, okay, next slide. And then there was something that is connected to these three concepts and also dealt with is a sentence that I also discussed with students, and that seemed to help them. It makes them think about, if we are truly committed, we must listen to the silences, that which is not written, and pay attention to the internal dynamics of communities and how we label their experiences. In our research, for example, we had a student who said, to also a little bit illustrate the other concept, who said he was from a North African immigration background. We interviewed students to discover where is the coloniality in our programs. And he said, well, I have studied for 3 years applied law, but in not any case we discussed law related to discrimination. And of course, in his life, well, that was a huge issue. But because of the teachers often not having access to these life worlds or not realizing what students coming from different groups or more sometimes from the margins and not from the dominant groups, that is not put on the table, then yeah, you are missing out, and you are labeling, or you are deciding what should be treated and what means applied law, without bringing in what does it mean in different spaces and different. So this was also something that I thought was important, to listen to the silences, because often in the silences and the things that we do not talk about also with students is very valuable information to understand better and to connect better. For example, since after that process, I radically committed to asking students always, what makes you do that? If they were too late or they didn't do whatever they want, normally you should, I should do this or that. No, have to reflect, no judging, taking time and going, what made you not handing over or not doing this? And if you then start talking with students, then you get a different understanding. And most of the times they have a very, not an excuse, but the reasoning or the way how things happen with them makes you think differently, and also improving your courses. So that was one of the small examples that I got out of it. So okay, yeah, the next slide. So at the end in the research, we had 3 main areas of decolonizing education in the Flemish context. I have to say, this is we interviewed 11 people, students from migratory background, and also activists in Flemish society who are active and are a little bit expert and had in the last 10 years been in higher education. So one huge area of decolonizing education is the Eurocentric perspective in the curriculum. For example, if you have, say, a global course in law or business, then there are many European countries often, and then the last we have the African law, or the global or the comparative. The other is brought in a way that is not equal to the rest of the chapters or the content, and it is also brought in a way that students can actually question, but they bump into the or the closeness of the professor. In our case, I'm talking about our context, not accepting that, for example, a Muslim woman comes and wants to reach out for different nuances and contextualization of, for example, Islamic law, so that they get stuck in the hierarchy in higher education. A second point is that the dynamics of power and relationships, race, gender, class, and geopolitical issues in the process of knowledge construction and the disciplines. Very classic example is, of course, the whole citation system, where people cite, how that is constructed, what theories have high status, who can say what, and so on. And then also third thing that we had are biases and well-intended teaching and learning approaches. For example, the images that you use, the ideas that you have. Another student said also, for example, we are always stimulated to think out of the box, but that is not for students like me. We want to stay, he and his friends. So he was talking about we, not as a representative of a whole group of students, but he, in his class, there was one other student from migratory background. He said, we do not go out of the box. We stay very well in the box because of language, of course, Dutch. We invest a lot in that. So the well-intended but biased, the structured teaching, the images that you use, the ideas that you use, that was also a very interesting part of the decolonization. And Gloria Wecker said it very nicely 2 years ago at the seminar from the KU Leuven. How has imperialism shaped our discipline? How are the stories? What are the stories that we like to tell ourselves? Also the area, for example, in diversity, and then maybe you can go to the next slide, I think. So that brings me a bit to bell hooks as an example, as a case that meant a lot to me as a teacher educator. So in the area of education, the huge, authors are, for example, John Hattie, Perkins, very psychodidactical and extremely very good scholars and interesting, and we learned a lot from them. But rarely we see, and I have been monitoring it a little bit as far as I know, people to see where come other dimensions in, because I have learned that education and this theory or psychodidactical, psychopedagogical aspects of learning are dominating, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not the only way of framing, understanding education and learning. And if you then go to authors like bell hooks, but also, for example, recently very interesting as well, secondary education, is Christopher Emdin, for example. Then you see a pedagogy of hope. Then you see love in education. Then you see education as, how does it say it here? Reality pedagogy and urban education, liberatory. So then becomes learning and education, something to me was completely new, and it has hardly a space in teacher education or in education. And this is the knowledge that is produced from non-dominant or other knowledge areas than what we usually expect. And I copied the content of one of her 3 books. She's mainly talking about higher education. Her most famous book is Teaching to Transgress, to go beyond the borders, or how do you say it, where students are confronted with. And if you see this could never be in any other manual for education, the will to learn, talking race and racism, how can we serve, I'm just saying keepers of hope, spirituality, and so on, a practical wisdom. So when I read her, I think why I wanted to share to her, and I'm coming a bit towards the end for a nice discussion, because all I knew, for example, from John Hattie, what I wrote in a small article, we know that the relationship with students and teachers is extremely important for the learning. You know that. But then when I read bell hooks, it became a different way of knowing. I understood it in a better and differently. And also, especially, she made me understood, she helped me to understand the discourse of diversity and the way we think about diversity differently and critically. And then you can go to the next slide. Yeah, I will come back to that. So I are some of her books. that are all very interesting, also teaching to transgress. And the style of her work is always in dialogue. So you can also find on YouTube many residency programs that she has done. You know, the professor can go for a week in residency, giving seminars, but she always invites people to go in dialogue, and she talks about things that makes you uncomfortable. You say, how can you talk about that? But she does it because, yeah, that's her style, and that's also what she's learning. Some concepts that are very important in her work is practical wisdom. So what I said before, the life world, the experiences, the daily practice, the life of students in our case is very important to not to ignore that and to start from there. But of course, also going beyond that, that's the wisdom. And there's also the relevance of theory and analyzing and analytical concepts to confront with this life experiences. She talks about ancestors, teaching to transgress, liberatory education, race, gender, and class, and that I thought was very interesting. We talk about ethno-cultural diversity and gender diversity, but we stick to the people, and she goes to the system. She talks about race, that's a word that we cannot even pronounce almost in our context. She talks about gender, she talks about class, and that is interesting. She says, to me, as far as I interpreted her, is she relates to students in a way of love. So yeah, there needs to be love in education, and this sounds very weird because we think of affections and foolish love and so, but it's not about that. It is about how can I serve? How can I relate to you so we can move beyond what you are experiencing here or have difficulties with? So looking for that, how can we go together here and going further? So that was very interesting. So every student, of course, we can start here a whole discussion about neoliberalism and how little time we have for that. So I know that that's other big conversations maybe. But if we look to the student and say, how can we move on from here? What are your experiences and how can we go beyond without lowering the bar at all? So she's high standards, she wants to stay there, that is obviously. And if we talk about the diversity, we talk about the system. And that was something I'm missing. I learned in all our discourse of diversity, talk about race, gender, the mechanisms of it, how bodies are racialized, how gender is racialized, what the impact of class is. Very interesting. She go also dialogue, critical consciousness, critical thinking, constructively critique, community, love, spirituality, and teaching as a vocation. Is a dimension, I think, especially for teacher education, is very interesting, but it has hardly any space as far as I know in the context. So I can go to the next slide. So last, it's a system. I think that could sometimes be more interesting to go from the system and that we are carriers of this system, because if you want to go into dialogue with students on diversity, it's difficult. They don't want to feel guilty, you know, probably what comes with it. But if we direct the attention also towards the system, it is not about us, the individuals, but it is about mechanisms that have been grown and that are doing their work even in our good intentions, and make understand that. That was a very valuable. So all students, serve all students, work with all students, take them seriously, not postpone judging, to dialogue with them, to work together in a learning process with them, but critique and understand the system was also one of the issues that I got out of this into my teaching practice, and that I'm still learning from, and still not easy. Yeah, I think that's the last one. Yeah, here are the two sources. I don't like the cover of the book of bell hooks, but don't get distracted to it because it's. I'm wondering if you read it, of people who have read it, who are here, what the impact was on their teaching, and their learning. So these are some of the issues that I've learned. I have the feeling I can tell much more, but maybe we should go more like question-wise. So.
Yeah, that sounds good, Karine. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I will just stop sharing these slides and hand over first to Tamara, just to sort of get us into the mindset of, okay, so how do you respond to this story? What resonated, what didn't, and what questions sort of came to the surface? I'd first like to hand over to Tamara, and then obviously feel free to jump into the conversation, as it is a big conversation that we're trying to have today. Tamara, how did you receive this this talk by Karine?
Thank you so much, Evika, for the invitation, and Karine, thanks so much for the time that you've taken with us today to explain your own personal process. What I think is that immediately what I like about your presentation is your positionality, telling us that you're coming from a posture of humility. So in your humbleness, you're able to acknowledge some practices that you might have had in the past and how you've made changes to those practices based on your encounter with literature, with bell hooks, with all of the people that you listed, which are amazing people talking about decolonization, and also talking about education and knowledge. So I really admire that with what you've done, and also with what I've seen in your scholarship. So thanks for bringing that, because I think one of the biggest challenges as an educator is to acknowledge your own positionality and your own and make yourself vulnerable so that you're able to interact with students and learn from them. And at the same time, be able to make changes to what you're doing as you see that it might reinforce structures and systems that we're actually trying to bring down. So my first point that I take from what you did was that positionality, recognizing who you are and where you're from. So you recognizing that you were educated and raised in a Eurocentric background, and then me recognizing that I came up in a colonial settler state. So being educated with that background means that you might be reinforcing those systems and trying to recognize what that means. What are you reinforcing? And calling it by what it is. So it is a system, and it is related to race, class, and gender, or sex most of the time. So using those actual words, and as you said, those are words that often are not used in the classroom. We kind of avoid them, but we have to actually recognize and call them for what they are. The second thing that I thought was really something to be highlighted from what you said is you're turning around what the priorities are. So it's not about necessarily immediately the knowledge, but there's a relationship there that you're building with your student and with all the students. And that relationship, as you pointed out in Bell Hooks's scholarship, is often described with the word love. So she uses that throughout her scholarship, and it might seem kind of strange in situations where we think of ourselves as neutral, or we try to be quote unquote objective. What does that mean for us? And how can we actually show compassion, care, and love towards students? And how does that make us feel? And I like that you talked about the feelings that you're going to have, because you're going to feel pain, hurt, discomfort. And so recognizing it, saying it out loud when it happens, acknowledging that it's going on with you, and also possibly letting others know that this can happen as we kind of see those things crumbling around us that we thought were really important and were part of what we consider to be the most important pinnacle to reach. And so those, I think that's really strong. And the fact that you brought those out is really important. And I think my last point that I want to make is who you're engaging with. You've said a lot here, so there's a lot of rich things to talk about. But I'm impacted by the fact that you're engaging with artists and you're engaging with the literature of decoloniality. So I'm specifying the literature from Latin America because I also find that literature to be very rich. So you were talking about Walter Mignolo and also Boaventura de Sousa de Santos. And it's really, those two authors, of course, are really important in terms of engaging with what they're saying and talking about regarding knowledge, regarding where knowledge comes from, and also understanding what you called the pluriversality of knowledge. And this is something that in a university setting is an important concept to really discuss, because we don't have a plural universe of knowledge a lot of times when we're teaching. So we're using very much Western-based readings and materials, and we're reinforcing then the system that actually we probably want to question and to critique. So I liked that, and regarding the artists, I think the idea that the word is definitely predominant, so it's got the dominant position in higher education, is something that has to be questioned. And I think the artists are the best place to go. And I love that you referenced that at the beginning. I'm also in a creative research course with artists, and we're looking at using orality as a form, because when you continue to make everything based on the word, actually the word compresses and the word distorts. And so there's some other things to think about in terms of understanding and knowing knowledge. And some of that involves orality. So in that particular course, we will be doing oral histories and learning about how to handle that and how maybe not to transcribe it, not to put it into a word. And so these are, I think, really important in terms of growing the universe of knowledge and how we see knowledge, and not accepting the written word as the only form of knowledge in our classes. So I'm going to stop at that because I do have some provocative questions that I'm going to pose to you, that to start off our dialogue with the rest of the people who've joined us. And I'm happy that we have so many people here joining us, and I hope you'll come into this conversation, because I'm going to start off the questioning, Karine, if you don't mind. I'm going to start it with this question, which is, as lecturers, so many of us that are on this call are lecturers, how do we identify and unlearn? And I'm going to take a quote from your article that you've written. You call it ingebakken denkpatronen. So I don't want to try to even decide what this means in English, but there's something inside of us that we're kind of born with in terms of how we view or think about things. And how can we identify that ourselves as lecturers?
It is dialogical. The answer is the dialogue with the students, especially the students that might be as far or differently situated, and they are actually all differently situated, but especially students, colleagues, people from somebody has high heels, from who are different positionalities and different situatedness. People, especially, for example, in Brussels, where we have so much diversity and people so coming from different backgrounds, that are the richest sources. But you have to be ready to have uncomfortable discussions or reflections, even though the setting is very casual and very cozy, but that are the most, and within the learning spaces, it is the students. And then it comes also the pain or the difficulty, uncomfortability to not decide to make the students undergo that, what you want them to undergo, which we were trained at university, I at least, the hierarchy, but to position you and ask them, tell me, how did that work for you? Tell me, how is that? But that's very difficult also for the students, because I notice when I ask a question to discuss and to construct knowledge together, then they say, well, I don't know if this is what you want to hear, but, and then I said in the article, then we stop the whole class. Where does that come from? That you think I want to hear something and I ask you to answer what I want to hear. And then we start discussing. But yeah, it's talking to people and always have that reflex, even if you think you know better, and even if you think you are the boss and in charge and you have the system, still position you with them and yeah, talk with them. And then you learn very often, unlearn the way you think, and you learn how other realities plays out. And that can be an advantage for you as a teacher, lecturer. Was that an answer to your question?
Thanks for starting it off, because I see Claudia's got her hand up, so I don't know if that means you're going to join in the conversation.
Maybe a follow-up question or a reaction, and I was typing, but I thought maybe I can just pose it with opening my microphone, because I was also triggered by the quote that you showed, that you said we must listen to the silences, and it relates a little bit to what Tamara was saying. And I can't help thinking that we're so conditioned, right, to only listen to what we hear, yeah, to what is available to us, and not go beyond that, not search beyond that, not, it is difficult to discover those unheard voices, and you say, yes, we must go into those uncomfortable dialogues with our students, but are we prepared to do that? Are we equipped as lecturers to do that? How do we make sure that we can do that? How can I as a lecturer make sure I can do that, and also help my colleagues do that? What is the strategy there? How can we equip ourselves to do that, other than creating the awareness of the need to do this, yeah, and discover those unheard voices and those different patterns of learning, and accepting different, perhaps different forms or different ways of packaging knowledge as well, and accepting what knowledge is. How do we move beyond that? Any tips, any ideas?
If I can react to that, then there's maybe somebody else. Aviola, maybe first. So.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Great. I think this is such a fascinating discussion, and I joined in because I am interested in this issue of decolonizing, educational systems, our curricula. And I'm just going to go back to something that Tamara mentioned that I think referred to what you discussed, the ingebakken denkpatronen. And I think for me, one of the challenges is the fact that this issue of decolonization of our curricula is multidimensional. In some respects, the ingebakken denkpatronen are also on the part of the, should we say, the environment that you find yourself in, the students and their culture and so on. So especially for students coming out of a conservative background, where there are limited rights for the vulnerable, for the women, and so on, having an alternative denkpatron, which is possibly, this Western focused curriculum, provides an alternative worldview. Another thing about the multidimensionality of this issue is the legacy of the curricula that have been inherited in many African countries, which were designed for another place, another time, another stage of development, where there is very little correlation between the actual needs, social, economic, political, and this level of developments of the societies that the students are being trained for. So you find there's a gap between what the students are learning and what the societies need. So the ingebakken denkpatronen that you're referring to here are multidimensional, not just on the part of the teacher with their own biases, unconscious biases, but also, on many different levels. For the one, I will say, yes, please, let's have an alternative viewpoint. Let's get women fully empowered. Let them step out of the conservative worldview that they are locked into. Yes, and if that's going to be the voice of the teacher, please bring it on. On the other hand, when you are teaching stuff that is of no relevance to the economies of the countries that the students are going to go into, you have to ask yourself, what are you teaching? And does this make any sense? Have you thought about how relevant this curriculum is? So and this is just my thoughts as a response to how do we decolonize? I think it's a very multifaceted issue in many areas. I don't know if I've really added anything to this, but just some thoughts on the multidimensionality of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Abiola. Maybe Karine and Tamara or anyone else would like to respond. There was first of all, a question from Claudia, very more practical one, and some thoughts that Abiola added as well as to the complexity, the multifacetedness of decolonizing curricula. So maybe some response first from Karine. What's going through your mind?
Yes. I'm going to do Claudia at first, just to hand back a reflection, because of course that's the $1 million question. How do we create dialogues? And I cannot answer that. I just wondered, is it because who I am, and I was always quite easily hurt, and things were quite, my human rights were always respected, and that I wonder if that might be also having an effect that I don't know how to dialogue very well. And that maybe in cases where that's not the case and people have to negotiate and to struggle, that, that there's better dialogue skills or that we could learn from. It's just a question that I have, because it's very difficult for me also to dialogue on difficult questions that makes uncomfortable. So I do not have an answer to that. And I just wondered, why is that also? And then thank you, Abiola, for adding that. Indeed, the layeredness is very strong in this debate. And thank you for pointing that out again.
Tamara, do you have any more reflections on Claudia's or Abiola's contributions?
Yeah, I think for approaching our students and anyone on difficult conversations, part of it is going to be the level of courage that we bring to it, because as we position ourselves and we let our students know where we are and what our positions are, that's also showing them the vulnerability that we have. And I think part of it also is then wanting to converse with them, because if you're talking about your vulnerabilities and your positionality, hopefully that's because you're trying to have a trustful relationship with the students. And as Bell Hooks talks about, it's about love. So it shouldn't be something that then puts up another barrier of fear. Instead, it's the moment for you to have courage to step out and start having those conversations. And I think when you relinquish your the power that's going on, the power dynamic, which of course it's still going to be there. It's not like you can erase it, but at least you're making for a situation where you're placing aside your positionality to have this conversation. Hopefully that also means that there's more empowerment on the side of the student to take part in the dialogue and to talk more freely about what's happening with them. And it's always nuanced, and it's always a learning situation. So you can expect yourself to hear things that you might be uncomfortable with and don't like. And then you have to monitor yourself for how you're responding to that. And sometimes the best way to respond is just to let everyone know what's happening with you. Like, this is causing me a lot of cognitive conflict because I think knowledge should only come from this source, and now you're suggesting some other things that I don't have any knowledge of and don't know about, and now I'm no longer the knowledgeable one in this situation. And so that can make you feel uncomfortable, but it also can help you learn how to share knowledge and how to allow the knowledge sources to be someone other than yourself. And when that happens, then you're starting to move toward in the directions that you have to move. So the shift, I like that Karine used that word about herself and what happened. She described it as a shift. And so recognizing that you do have to make that shift. So there is movement on your part so that your positionality is somewhere else. That allows this to happen, I think.
Thank you, Tamara. And I saw that Anouk, you posted something in the chat, a toolbox. Would you like to say anything about that? Why would that be a useful resource, or maybe some input when we're deliberating on, what does it take from us as lecturers, as educators, to really be able to dialogue well and in an uncomfortable subject?
Yes, I'm reacting actually to, I was triggered by Claudia's questions about how to do this in a practical way. And that made me think about this toolbox of the University of Utrecht, because I think there are some parallels with this discussion, and please have a look and see if it does. But what I find insightful is that it's full of examples of students. For example, a teacher was using a stereotype. Teacher wasn't aware of that, but it also includes the reaction of the students and how it made that student feel. Because I think it's also indeed a process of a lecture realizing that it might have an impact on someone, even if you didn't have the intention to do so. So I think there's also a patience needed from that side, and it would be very interesting to see what kind of professionalization strategies could be adopted to that and are needed. So please have a look to see if it's useful for you.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing, Anouk. And I think indeed having these cases and seeing what are reactions, real reactions, might be helpful. Linda, I see you wanted to react as well, so go ahead.
Yeah, I don't really have an answer to the question Mara asked. Yeah, just another difficulty. Because what I often experience when I try to unlearn or start an open dialogue with students in the classroom, I already had the experience a few times that students would say to me, okay, but we're discussing this now, but how does this relate to other things we're teaching in the we're learning in the classes and the learning goals? And then actually the only answer I have is, yeah, it doesn't. For example, when I discuss Orientalism with them during classes about how to interact with other cultures, then I'm a bit, how do you say? I feel a bit, I don't know the right word, but yeah, so as a few of you already before mentioned that the curriculum is pointed in a certain way often. So sometimes in the classroom you can start this open dialogue, but you still have to be sure that you also match the learning goals, and because and sometimes it gets really confusing also for students, because sometimes it almost looks like you're teaching on 2 tracks, and yeah, that's something I want to prevent too. So that's what I experience during classes like this as well. And I was wondering if you have experienced the same, or maybe you have, I don't know, tips or other thoughts about it.
Thank you, Linda. I think that's something that we can definitely recognize. You know, you have to teach towards a syllabus. There's a test at the end of a teaching term, and yet you still want to have this meaningful space to have, you know, true dialogue with your students. And yeah, on the one hand, you feel that pressure in yourself, and you have students questioning, why are we addressing this? Because I want to get prepped for the assessment. Karine, is there anything that you learned through the process that can help in this?
It's very difficult question. First of all, I think Orientalism is if I would use in my context, also quite a difficult concept. But I think it's also about essentialism. But I would say react now. If students say, well, how does that relate? I think we should take that also into account. I don't know how, but now I think, yeah, we should start from there. They are right, not right, but if that's their concern and then experience, how can we move on from there? Maybe it's for some students doesn't have any meaning, but maybe other students do know and recognize and might be happy that you offer that and you put that on the table, and we can move from there as a teaching community. But this is all very abstract and very difficult, Linda. So already great that you do that, I think.
Linda, maybe a brief reaction from you. I'm mindful of time as well, so.
Sorry, yeah. Yeah, it's exactly what you say. Some students will recognize it, others won't. And I think that's absolutely fine for everyone. It's a learning process. I just wanted to add that sometimes, even when the students do recognize it, and they, yeah, I've had a few times that they found it an important topic, for example. But then they kind of concluded, but that's not what we're learning. So how should we cope with this? And yeah, I don't have an answer to that actually, but yeah, I think that's the process we're in all together with decolonizing education.
Yeah, thank you so much, Linda. And I see some people are writing in the chat as well, but we only have 1 more minute to go. And I think that it's indeed allowing ourselves the space to reflect on this together, and also to reach out as peers, and for us to engage in that kind of dialogue. So one of the things we're thinking of is, with the big conversations tend to be more sort of, you know, touching upon bigger concepts, but there might be some value or relevance in us convening, you know, after big conversation and continuing seeing, okay, so you know, what experience do we have? What have we tried? What do we know? And what is the next step that we could take, maybe as a group of peers? So unfortunately, we have to leave it for what it is for today. But you should be interested in maybe convening in a smaller setting, more intimate space, to continue, you know, the questions that you raised, the doubts we have. We might not have answers yet, but I think one positive step is to try and, you know, go on this journey together, and seeking out, you know, how do we deal with this level of discomfort ourselves. So for now, I'd like to really thank Karine and Tamara for joining us today. Thank you so much. We'll give you a round of digital applause, if we may, from all the participants that are still there. And hope to be welcoming you to maybe a smaller conversation or another big conversation online. Thank you so much, everyone. Wishing you a wonderful end of the afternoon, or a very pleasant evening ahead of you. Thank you very much.